Now we're going to look at some examples of means and chains to make everything a little bit more concrete. Let's just quickly review means and chain theory. A product or a brand has features. These are attributes or characteristics. They can be concrete, something tangible, something we can touch, we can identify distinctly, or they can be abstract, where they're a collection or constellation of different concrete attributes. These features are important only because they have consequences. Consequences can be both positive and negative, right? And we can kind of classify these consequences as either being functional, which means that they help accomplish some goal. They're a means to an end. Experiential, where we experience them in some central way. Or psychosocial, where it either gives us self-esteem or makes us believe that other people are going to view us more positively. Normally, we think that functional consequences lead to psychosocial consequences. Consequences themselves are important, and therefore the features are important, because they help consumers or individuals attain important values. Values are the things that you want to be, what you would want to be known for. If somebody was to talk about you and you're a fly on the wall, the values represent what you would want them to say about you. Values can be instrumental. They're kind of modes of behavior. They're action, they're verbs, or terminal. They're end states, how we want to feel or be. So the whole idea is simply that consumers buy products because they have important features that deliver meaningful consequences, and these features and consequences are important because they help people attain important values. All of you are in college and picked a college in that path because going to college, at least you believe, has important positive consequences, benefits. You'll end up with an education, you'll end up with a better job, you'll end up making more money, and you'll be more successful and happy in your life. Those are the important values at the end. Here are some examples of means and chains. Actually, you might have seen these previously. Let's look at the first one, hairspray. It's a product class, which means it's a general means and chain for all types of hairspray. One attribute that many hairsprays may have is that it's a pump dispenser. It's not an aerosol can. The functional consequences is that it's a light mist. Your hair isn't tacky because it has no chemicals from the aerosol. That makes you feel more attractive. That's going to impress others. And that's going to make you feel better about yourself. One thing that is important to note when looking at means and chains is that sometimes it's really hard to make a clear distinction between what's a psychosocial consequence and a value, or an instrumental value versus a terminal value, and so forth. And it's not really that important because you're kind of moving up this chain from very specific things to much more abstract things. And as long as you can kind of get to that end state or feeling value that people are looking for, everything's fine. It's really not that important to make these distinctions. Again, looking back at hairspray, a second attribute was that it's unscented. It has a natural odor. That's the functional consequence. And the psychosocial thing is I can be myself. I can be the real me, right? Sometimes there may not be a value attached to something, especially in an advertisement. Let's look at the potato chips, flavored potato chips. Okay, so we have barbecue flavor. It tastes good. My guests enjoy themselves more. Therefore, I have a good party. I get more social recognition. Another thing about means and chains, what we'll see in the next example, is that common attributes or functional consequences can lead to multiple psychosocial consequences. So it isn't always one-to-one, but you should be able to trace any one attribute or feature all the way through to an end value. Then if we look at the next attribute for flavored potato chips, They're high in calories. So it's a negative one because it helps me gain weight. That makes me unattractive to others, and it makes me feel bad about myself. Let's look at the Scope mouthwash. So now we're doing it for a brand. The first attribute is that it's sugarless. So it doesn't have calories. It's non-fattening. It makes me more attractive. It makes me feel better about myself. I personally wouldn't have thought that would be a really important attribute for mouthwash because you're not supposed to swallow it. But anyway, let's look at the second one, fluoride. It stops cavities. Now they stop it there, but you could obviously think of some other consequences. So if it stops cavities, then that means I have more pleasant, when I go to the dentist, I don't have to have cavities and get drilled. My experience at the dentist is less painful. I'm probably praised more and not chided by the dental hygienist and the dentist to take better care of my teeth. And ultimately, it saves me money, especially if I don't have the greatest dental benefits, and it helps me feel better about myself. And then the last consequence down there was, okay, it's just mouthwash, right? So sometimes the brand can just be the fact what the product is. I mean, not the brand, but the attribute, right? The functional consequence of mouthwash is it avoids bad breath. It makes me feel confident in social situations. Therefore, I perform better. And when I perform better, it's really not an end value in my estimation. I feel better about myself. I'm going to be more successful. I'm going to lead the life that I want. So normally, as you can tell, we'll talk more about values another time because they're important and they're the vaguest and mushiest and most abstract kind of idea. But usually they end up ultimately with yourself, making yourself feel better about yourself in some important way. The previous examples we looked at were just made up from basic rational logic. This means end chain, which is for FedEx overnight delivery services, was actually developed by interviewing quite a few business people. The technique used for this is called laddering, and we'll, again, later on, look more closely into laddering, and that's a technique that we'll use to build our own means end chains for our brand. But anyway, so let's try to take a look at this. And you'll notice that this one is kind of oriented, so the attributes are at the bottom, functional consequences come next, psychosocial consequences, and then personal values. And you can just see from the diagram that there's multiple features, all right? Dropbox, many locations, long operating hours, package tracking software. Those tend to be concrete attributes. And then they do lead up to at least one abstract attribute, convenient, right? Which would be in that first cluster on the far left. And also reliable, which is right to the right of that kind of cluster. That also is an abstract attribute. But I'm not so worried about the differences between concrete and abstract, but it's a pretty good example if you're struggling with that. So anyway, so you take the Dropbox and the many locations and the long operating hours, and that makes it convenient. And the fact that also that it's convenient means that it's easy to use, so it saves time and effort. So if we travel up the path on the left-hand side of functional consequences, you also note that reliable goes to on-time delivery, which is, in these people's mind, connected to convenience, or at least actually connected to saves time and effort, because it's always on time, you don't have any hassles. Because it saves a person time and effort, that makes them more productive. Right? That's probably more a functional consequence than the psychosocial consequence, all right? But certainly that has to make somebody feel better about themselves and doing their job. And as you climb from more productive, it leads to personal accomplishment, that they feel good. That's probably the top of the psychosocial consequences. And again, that leads to them having self-esteem about themselves as being efficient and being good at their job. We can see if we go back down, the reliable, right, which is just to the right of the drop box in many locations, long operating hours. That leads to on-time delivery, which now makes the person look good. So that's probably a psychosocial consequence. And we can note that before we go up that the last concrete attribute, which is package tracking software, that leads to real-time record of packages and handling, abstract attribute. Okay, that also leads to makes me look good. And then because I look good, I'm more likely to get promoted. Is it okay to have psychosocial consequences lead to functional consequences? Of course. All right, again, the order isn't so important as long as it kind of makes sense if you view it from the eyes of the person who's giving the information or potentially of your consumer. And then if you get promoted, you get more money. And then you get more money, it gives you personal accomplishment, you have more things to do, your wife loves you more, you can buy more toys, you can send your kids to boarding school so you don't have to deal with them, but obviously it leads to self-esteem. And then if we look at real-time record of package handling, see who signs it, right? Then you know that you're not responsible for somebody else's error, right? They can't blame you, that you're covered, you have control of this. And because you know that, you did your job, it says it was sent, FedEx will make sure that if it gets delivered, somebody signs for it, you know that they can't blame you for not doing it or putting in the wrong address or whatever. Okay, you don't have to worry about this anymore. All right, so it causes less stress, and somehow that led to a sense of belonging. I'm not really sure what that means without doing the research, but obviously it makes you feel more confident about yourself. And what you're doing and everything. And again, that's going to lead ultimately to self-esteem. So we can see that the fact that, hey, it's easy and convenient, it's on time, it makes you look good, and that makes you look good to your bosses, and it's going to help you do well, right? And the fact that you can track this and you know exactly who signed for it when, that kind of makes sure that you don't get blamed for any issues that aren't your fault. So that's the means end chain for FedEx. And you can see how there's a lot of themes in there to build a communication or promotional strategy around. Now let's see if we can pull a means end chain out of a couple of ads. Here's one for Ford F-150 titled Jump.
When gas prices jump, you still gotta work. So suddenly you're cutting back on everything from family vacations to cell phone minutes. Well, here's a thought. How about cutting back on gas? Here's how. The Ford F-150. It gets 23 highway miles per gallon. That's the best. So you can get the job done and get a break at the pump. Yeah, can you hear me now? This is the future. This is the Ford F-150.
Now let's see if we can identify a means end chain in an actual commercial. This is a commercial for a Ford F-150 pickup truck entitled Jump.
Okay, when gas prices jump, you still gotta work. So suddenly you're cutting back on everything from family vacations to cell phone minutes. Well, here's a thought. How about cutting back on gas? Here's how. The Ford F-150. It gets 23 highway miles per gallon. That's the best. So you can get the job done and get a break at the pump. Yeah, can you hear me now? This is the future. This is the Ford F-150.
You might want to watch the commercial several times and see if you can come up with a means end chain. Here's the one that I came up with. The main feature was 23 miles per gallon. That would be a concrete attribute. A functional consequence was, hey, it lowers your costs at the pump. That helps you save money. Another functional consequence is You don't have to cut back on things that are important to the wife and children. The beginning of the commercial, they talked about how you don't want to have to cut back on cell phone usage or family vacations. The commercial doesn't have to introduce the elements of a means end chain in the order of the means end chain. They can do it in any order they want. That's going to lead to a psychosocial consequence that's relatively implied, but hey, now I can be a good provider for my family because I don't have to cut back on these things. And as a terminal value, that makes me a good family man, a good husband, and a good father. The commercial also did present another functional consequence of the 23 miles per gallon, and that was you could still get the job done, implying that the engine and the truck was still powerful enough for the type of work that you would use a truck for. It really didn't link up to any other values, which is not uncommon in a lot of commercials. Here is a typical perfume or cologne ad. There's almost no words, no real attributes, but certainly there's a means end chain here. When looking at the ad, you have a brand name, Gucci Guilty. You have a picture of the perfume container with the logo of the two G's interlocking for Gucci Guilty. Then, of course, you have the picture of two people without any clothes on, in close physical contact. The guy looks like a pretty handsome guy, and he has his eyes closed, and he looks like we can all imagine what he's thinking about. And then you have a young, beautiful woman, perfectly made up, kind of looking back at the camera while she has this guy kind of all over her. What's the means end chain here? Okay, well, you could say the feature is the brand itself, Gucci Guilty. And obviously, it makes her smell sexy. It doesn't have to, means end chains and portions of it don't have to be stated explicitly. Most of the time, they're implied, especially for when they go to values that we're a little uncomfortable thinking about or talking about. Psychosocial consequence, she's able to feel like she can attract sexy men, or makes her feel more attractive, that she's sexy. Instrumental value, along the way, she's going to have a hot and fulfilling social life. And ultimately, she's going to be able to experience life to the fullest, including any of those naughty or guilty pleasures. This is typical for a lot of ads that involve beauty, luxury, things that lead to values where we may be a little uncomfortable talking about them. This ad is really no different than an Axe ad that shows some kind of ordinary, scrawny guy having all these beautiful women falling over himself. They use humor to make the point, to make it more comfortable for people to kind of deal with. These ads, these print ads, usually for perfume and products like that, usually let the viewer use their imagination. They let you fill in the blanks for whatever are the important values that you want to hold. Still, there's a very explicit means and chain included in this ad. So that's a look at several examples of means and chains. Now, just to summarize, means and chains can be simple, or as we saw with the FedEx, it can be rather complex. Single features or consequences can lead to multiple consequences or values. So things can have multiple meanings and consequences for consumers. And in expressing means and chains in marketing communications, sometimes it can be done explicitly, where you tell the consumer or the viewer what they should think or feel. and other times it's implicit, where we let the consumer draw their own conclusion because stating it explicitly might be uncomfortable or might not be credible. So those are means and chains examples. Next thing that we're going to learn about are values and trying to get a better grip on what exactly are values and what values are important in our culture.